Welcome to SierraCast TV, where we like to take a deep dive into the most fascinating topics of the day. So hit that subscribe button and join us on YouTube, Facebook, and Spotify so you never miss a thing today. Um, we're going to be wading into the murky waters of presidential pardons, specifically focusing on Donald Trump's legal battles
Yeah.
and this idea that he might try to pardon himself. Now, we've got two really interesting sources for this deep dive. We've got an article by Jonathan Turley. He's a legal scholar from George Washington University. And we've also got a recent piece from ABC News about a ruling on some of Trump's immunity claims. So what are the limits of presidential pardon power? And could Trump really pull off this unprecedented maneuver? Let's find out. Yeah. What's so fascinating about this whole thing is that the Constitution gives the president incredibly broad pardon powers. And historically, there have been very few limitations on how these powers can actually be used, which raises some serious questions about, accountability. Yeah, it does make you think, like, theoretically, could a president pardon someone who robbed a bank just because they felt like it?
Well, while the power is vast, it's not completely without limits. There are some legal scholars who'd argue that pardons can't be used to obstruct justice, for example. But even with those potential limitations, there's a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah.
And we've seen some pretty controversial pardons throughout history.
Right, like when Ford pardoned Nixon after Watergate. I mean, that caused a huge uproar, didn't it? And it feels like there's just this potential for these pardons to really shake public trust in the whole system.
Absolutely. The Nixon pardon is a prime example of how a president can use this power to shield someone from consequences, even when there's strong evidence of wrongdoing. And it really sparked a national debate about the very nature of justice and accountability. And you can imagine what kind of constitutional earthquake we might experience if a president actually tried to pardon themselves.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics here. This article by Jonathan Turley argues that the Constitution doesn't actually say a president can't pardon themselves, even though it's never been tried before. It's like this power is so absolute that even the Founding Fathers didn't think to rule it out.
Yeah, that's exactly what makes this situation so unique. I think Turley points out that the Constitution's wording is surprisingly open on this point. It leaves a lot open to interpretation. And he makes a very compelling argument that from a purely textual standpoint, there's nothing in there that would stop a president from actually issuing a self-pardon.
But he doesn't seem too thrilled about that idea, does he? He calls it a disastrous idea, which is a pretty strong stance for a legal scholar. What makes him so concerned about the potential consequences?
Well, Turley isn't just worried about the legal implications. He's also thinking about the broader impact on American democracy as a whole. He argues that a self-pardon would strike at the heart of the rule of law, this core principle that everyone is equal under the law.
Right. It's that whole no one is above the law idea. But if a president can just pardon themselves for anything, it kind of throws that out the window. It's like saying, yeah, I can break the rules, and I'm the only one who gets to decide if there are consequences. It feels very Game of Thrones.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Think about how that would make people feel. If you can't trust the highest office in the land to uphold the law, how can you trust the system as a whole, right? It could lead to this widespread loss of faith in the justice system, which is really a cornerstone of any functioning democracy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's not just about the immediate impact either. Turley also points out these long-term dangers of setting a precedent like this. What would stop future presidents from just abusing this power if it became normalized?
Exactly. That's a key part of his argument. If Trump were to pardon himself, it could create a slippery slope where future presidents feel emboldened to use this power for personal gain or just to shield themselves from accountability. It could weaken the checks and balances that are supposed to be in place to prevent tyranny.
It's interesting because this whole discussion about self-pardons is hypothetical. It's never actually happened before. But there are real-world cases happening right now that could make this a very real issue.
I think you're talking about the New York hush money case. That's where things start to get really interesting, because it brings this abstract constitutional debate into a very concrete legal battle.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be looking at when we come back after a quick message. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to delve into the specifics of that case and see how it connects to this whole idea of a self-pardon. And while you're waiting, don't forget to subscribe to SierraCast TV on YouTube, Facebook, and Spotify for more fascinating deep dives like this one. Okay, so we're back, and before the break, we were kind of setting the stage for this legal drama that's unfolding, and we've got this concept of a self-pardon hanging in the air, something that could totally rewrite the rules for presidents. But now we're going to get into the specifics of Trump's current legal situation, specifically this hush money case in New York, to see how it all connects.
Right. This hush money case really gives us some real-world context for this whole theoretical debate about self-pardons. And the ABC News piece we've got here highlights this recent ruling on Trump's claims of immunity. And that could have some major implications if he were to actually consider pardoning himself.
Okay, so let's unpack that ruling.
Yeah.
What was Trump actually arguing, and how did the judge respond?
Well, basically, Trump's lawyers were trying to say that he was immune from this whole case because he's the president-elect. They were arguing that any kind of prosecution would interfere with his presidential duties. However, the judge completely rejected that argument.
Wow, so the judge is saying that even though he's about to be president again, he still doesn't get a free pass on this case. That's kind of surprising they even tried that argument. It almost sounds like they're testing the waters for something bigger.
Yeah, it's definitely a bold legal strategy.
Yeah.
And then the judge's response was pretty decisive. The judge basically said, look, this case poses absolutely no threat to how the executive branch functions, meaning there's no real reason to grant him immunity. So it's a pretty
Really?
clear rejection of Trump's argument.
So how does this all tie back into the potential for a self-pardon?
Well, imagine this. Trump is back in the Oval Office. The hush money case is still going on, and he's looking at some potential legal consequences. It's not hard to see how he might be tempted to use that pardon power to just get himself out of the whole mess.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if this whole immunity argument was just a way to set the stage for a potential self-pardon down the line.
It's certainly possible, and it's important to keep in mind that Trump has used the pardon power before to benefit his allies, like with Roger Stone and Michael Flynn. So it wouldn't be completely out of character for him to consider doing the same for himself.
But wouldn't that be way more controversial than those other pardons? I mean, those were already pretty divisive.
Oh, absolutely. A self-pardon,
Yeah.
especially in a case where he's already been found liable, would be seen by many as a blatant disregard for the entire justice system. It would send shockwaves through the legal and political landscape.
It's interesting you bring up that he's always been found liable in this case. Does that actually change anything in terms of whether he could even attempt a self-pardon?
Well, legally speaking, there's nothing in the Constitution that would prevent a president from pardoning themselves, even in a case where they've been found guilty or liable. But like we've been saying, the political and ethical implications would be huge.
So it sounds like a potential legal minefield.
Yeah.
But this hush money case isn't over yet, right? There are still some legal moves happening. The ABC News article mentions that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is actually trying to sentence Trump after his second term, just to preserve the jury's verdict.
Yeah. And that's another sign that this case is far from over. The DA's office seems pretty determined to make sure that the legal process plays out, regardless of Trump's presidential status.
But Trump's lawyers aren't just sitting back. They're pushing back pretty hard. They called this move thuggish tactics, which makes it sound like they're ready for a fight.
That language definitely suggests they're not going to go down without a fight. They see this as an attempt to kind of work around Trump's potential return to power. And they're using some pretty strong language to condemn it all. It really speaks to the level of tension surrounding this case.
Yeah, it feels like the whole situation is escalating. It's a legal battle. It's a political battle. It's a PR battle.
Yeah.
It's everything all at once.
Got it. It's
Yeah.
a high-stakes game with the potential for some pretty far-reaching consequences, and it's playing out on multiple fronts.
Well, we're going to take a moment to let all of this sink in. But when we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive into presidential pardons, and we'll explore what all of this could mean for the future of American democracy. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of presidential pardons. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? We've gone from like the history of this power to the potential fallout of a self-pardon. And of course, we've been keeping a close eye on this whole hush money case in New York.
It really is a fascinating mix of law, politics, and history. And like we've been talking about, it raises some big questions about accountability, the rule of law, and the future of American democracy as a whole.
I feel like my head is spinning trying to keep up with it all. So as we wrap things up, what are the key takeaways here for our listeners? What do we really need to understand about these presidential pardons and where this whole thing could be heading?
I think the biggest thing to remember is just how serious a self-pardon would be. We're in uncharted territory. There's no legal precedent for this. And as we've discussed, the consequences could be huge. It could totally change the balance of power in our government.
It's kind of scary to think that the answer to whether this is even allowed is, we don't know.
Yeah.
We'll have to see what happens.
Right.
It really shows how much is riding on how this power is interpreted. And it makes these legal battles, like this hush money case,
Yeah.
even more important.
Definitely. These cases aren't just legal disputes. They're testing the limits of presidential power and how strong our democratic institutions really are. The outcome of these cases could have a lasting impact on how we understand the presidency and the rule of law.
We've also talked about how a self-pardon could really damage people's trust in the justice system. If people think that the president is above the law, why should anyone else follow the rules? Right? It could create this sense of like cynicism and disillusionment that's hard to come back from.
That's so important. The rule of law depends on everyone believing that everyone is held to the same standard, no matter how powerful they are. A self-pardon could really hurt that principle and weaken the foundation of our whole democracy.
And then there's the worry that a self-pardon would set a dangerous precedent for future presidents. It could open the door to a level of executive power that was never intended and potentially lead to more abuses down the line.
It's that slippery slope argument that makes this so concerning. If we say this is okay, where do we draw the line? What would stop future presidents from using this power to avoid any kind of accountability? It's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. And this whole hush money case really brings all of these worries to the forefront. It's a real-world example of how this self-pardon idea could actually play out with real consequences.
It's a high-stakes legal battle with the potential to change the presidency and set a new standard for how we think about executive power and accountability.
Well, we've definitely given our listeners a lot to ponder today. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final question to think about. If Trump actually pardoned himself, what would that tell the world about the American justice system? And what would it say about the state of our democracy?
That's the question we all need to be asking, because the answer could shape the future of our country.
Can't say it better myself. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into presidential pardons and what they might mean for us all. We encourage you to keep learning about these issues and talk about them with others. This is a conversation that needs to happen. And remember, if you want to explore more about news and analysis, don't forget to subscribe to SierraCast TV on YouTube, Facebook, and Spotify for more deep dives just like this one. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, stay curious.